In part 1, we introduced you to the saga raging around old graves possibly being dug up for the building of a housing development. Graves of people who died from mostly eradicated horrendous infectious and contagious diseases in the late 1800s up until the 1950s. The land is known as Rietfontein Farm in the Linksfield area in Johannesburg and is home to what used to be the old Rietfontein Tropical Disease Hospital, now named Sizwe. The hospital was built 120 years ago in 1895, a day's march away from the fast-growing Johannesburg city centre because of the contagious nature of the illnesses which were treated there. The remains of thousands who perished at the hospital were buried in cemeteries on the property in order to prevent further infection by transporting bodies elsewhere. Today, the hospital only treats cases of extremely drug-resistant tuberculosis. A tender for the construction of a 20 billion rand mixed-use housing development on about 170 hectares of Rietfontein has been granted by the Department of Human Settlements. The development will contain 8,000 houses, including affordable housing, shopping centres, office parks and an industrial park, amongst other things. But records from the old Rietfontein Hospital, which indicate where the graves are buried on the land or who is buried in the graves, are believed to have been lost to a fire. For many years now, the majority of the graves have lain unmarked and most are undetectable to the naked eye. Can anyone safely say that graves won't be dug up or built over during the development process? Despite serious religious taboos hinged to exhuming human remains, other objections from some people in surrounding communities stem from fears that digging up the old infectious graves could have serious health implications.
It would be a thundering mistake to even mess with the chance of releasing smallpox. And the last outbreak in which there were quite a number of patients was in the 1930s. So it's not that long ago. And I think most virologists would agree that the viability issue is low. But to go and wantonly excavate without being certain would alert world attention, I would think.
Smallpox, which is a relatively robust virus, in other words, it can survive relatively well in the environment. There's no proof that it can survive under natural conditions for more than a decade or two at the most.
In part 1, we introduced you to Naomi Deneur, a community member voluntarily researching the history of the old Rietfontein Hospital and graveyard for about 25 years. In a rare opportunity in 1995, she visited the hospital during a public open day and saw what the area looked like 20 years ago.
I saw fields of metal markers. I took pictures of some. I didn't realize at the time how important they will be in years to come. And they told me about that there are 7,000 to 8,000 people buried there, and all as a result of terrible diseases.
Out on the Rietfontein land, Naomi showed me some of the few metal markers still existing today, which were used to number each grave because they were supposedly stolen and sold for scrap metal. The markers, as well as numbers on the actual gravestones, show that the number of graves on the property is around 4,000 and said to be of different races, nationalities and religious backgrounds. After Special Assignment aired part 1 of Forgotten Graves, Forgotten Diseases last week, we received a call from a troubled Annetjie Potgieter, a resident of Jeffreys Bay in the Eastern Cape.
I'm a direct descendant of one of the persons who were buried in Rietfontein Hospital graveyard. It was my grandmother, Maria Boardman from Potchefstroom. She died there approximately 1937-38. I'm not quite sure about the date, but she died there with the pox disease. Her whole family was affected with the disease, and they were transported from Potchefstroom with ambulances and also with a curse to the Rietfontein Hospital. And the other family recovered, but it seems my grandmother was too old to recover, and she died there.
Many years ago, Annetjie ventured to Rietfontein to try and visit her late grandmother's grave.
I don't know where's the grave. I went to the office and I asked Mr. Venter that was working there at that period if I can have some records because I'm busy with family history. And he said to me, unfortunately, they can't help me because there was a fire and all records been destroyed. They took me to the graveyard, but we couldn't get any information there. So I was so upset. I was crying. So I went back and I said to them, please can they just search and phone me, if they find anything. So I haven't heard from them. And then in 1991, before I moved to the Eastern Cape, I went there back again to see if they find anything or they clean up the area. And it was still in the same state.
She's upset that no effort's been made to locate the lost graves and that no effort's been made to contact the family members of the people buried there.
What will happen to that graves? You can't dig up really bones. Nobody wants that. So I would rather say, declare that a history, something for the history, put a memorial, make it a memorial graveyard or something like that. At least we know that our people who died there doesn't really died in vain.
Anneke raises important questions about what happens when graves can no longer be identified and family members no longer sought. We asked Professor Farid Esak at the University of Johannesburg.
Families can contest the exhumation of bodies. Family can protest it. And in general, the courts strike a fine and a good balance between the feelings of the family and the demands of the law. If the family cannot be identified, the immediate family, identifiable family, as in the Western sense of the word, that body really then belongs to the state, and the state, in this case the municipality, can do with it what it wants to do.
As examined in Part 1 last week, some fear that disturbing the sleeping graves may awaken, among others, the completely eradicated virus of smallpox into society again. While Professor John Freen at the Institute for Communicable Diseases isn't concerned about the reintroduction of diseases like smallpox or plague due to the development, he has raised some concern.
The one exception is anthrax, because that organism has the ability to survive in the environment under the right conditions again for decades, or some people claim even centuries.
Anthrax, a bacteria, is often found surviving as spores in soil and can cause disease and even death in humans and animals. A woman who, like Naomi, was also researching the hospital and graves before she immigrated overseas, claims to have lost a relative to anthrax at Rietfontein Hospital.
Barbara Udelowitz told me that she started to be interested in doing a research when she found that two relatives of her are buried at Rietfontein. One was the sister of her mother, and she said, and she died of anthrax, according to Mrs. Udelowitz. And she said that she came with her mother as a child to pay respect, and then when she came as an adult, tried to find a grave. She couldn't locate it anymore. And another boy that died from her family, and she also couldn't locate his grave. So that's what prompted her to do the research. And there are imported sources, because they say, I lost a relative to anthrax. We don't know where the anthrax victims are buried.
The evidence that there's anthrax on the site is circumstantial or hearsay. I haven't seen any written evidence that anthrax was ever present on the site.
But due to hospital records being lost, oral narration has become one of the only links to the history of the hospital, so it can't be completely dismissed. There are also reports that there are large numbers of animals which died from anthrax buried on Rietfontein Farm.
It's certainly credible or plausible because it was a working farm at one stage, and we know that anthrax affected stock animals in South Africa. There used to be quite a lot of anthrax around, but that applies to very many open ex-farm sites in the country.
Construction Occupational Health and Safety Officer and community member Bianca Jutin is concerned about the potential spread of anthrax in dust which will be generated during the development.
If you are not digging the depth of a grave, but you're digging to just above the depth of a grave, and you are then disposing of that soil then needs to be moved on a truck. And since there are no spoil areas in the immediate area, they would have to be trucked either through to Midrand or somewhere else where they would then be used as backfill, which means that people then along the route for the spoil would then end up being exposed.
The spores are the infectious agent or item for anthrax, and then they can be dispersed and breathed in. The thing is that humans are relatively resistant to anthrax. You need quite a big dose of anthrax spores to cause infection.
The risk is really to the folk that get directly exposed to the anthrax spores, where they could be, the anthrax is not seen that frequently, and unless one linked it all up, certainly some people working on the site would be at risk of death.
During the construction of this shopping centre on a small section of Rietfontein in 1995, also opposed by the community, animal bones were dug up. The late Dr. Benny Miller is pictured here with the bones, which tested negative for anthrax. Stipulations from the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development for granting the developer environmental authorization is that if any animal or human bones or material is exposed during construction, all work is to stop and a health expert is to be called in to determine if there is any health risk. The communities also accused Bokamoso, a company which compiled the environmental impact assessment, of deliberately omitting important environmental factors on the land.
The grassland biome, Bankenveld, is expected to have 500 species of plants. There are somewhere between 15 and 30 types of grasses alone. Once it's ploughed, you kill off the natural biome, the Bankenveld. It doesn't recover. Well, it does, but it takes 40, 60 years to recover. And even then, it may never fully recover with some of the rarer plants.
The way it's been explained to me is Bankenveld runs pretty much right along our mountain ranges. So any outcrops that you have from Table Mountain all the way up through the Drakensberg, up through this part and up into other parts of Africa. And what you'll find in Bankenveld is it has different types of protea type plants in it. So that's why something like that, if it's growing, and if I'm right, and it is a protea type plant, then that's quite significant for the grassland here. Yes.
The expert which the EAP employed did not do a good job. Went there, I think, in June, which is ridiculous, because it's winter time and there's virtually nothing growing there.
Wetland expert Paul Farrell says that the environmental report doesn't accurately assess the river floodlines and wetland systems in the area. He says the development could lead to disaster.
You will have houses too near to the edge of the river. That wall of water will wash those houses away. There's no mention that wetlands are clearly defined, but there is no mention of what the water from Central Joburg, the amount of water, and the strength of that water. What happens to that on the floodplains that is next to the river? There should be a wide buffer zone for at least 300 meters on the flat areas around the river to be able to control the flood. If you don't, you will take out 10, 12,000 people, 3 o'clock in the morning, will drown in Schwetla and Alexandra. This is where you're not thinking past a wire fence or boundary. They have not tied up that development in the environment of the northeast of Johannesburg.
We're finding more and more that the destruction of biodiversity is causing side problems, which sometimes become very big and often don't get realized until the damage is done.
The Community Action Group has recently lodged an official appeal against the environmental report and the authorization which was granted for the development.
There are definite problems with the report. Is the report legal? Yes. Does it do everything that it's supposed to do? Yes. Is it correct? No. I think there needs to be a very clear understanding of that, in that it has taken place, but it has not been done correctly.
But I think there are other health-related aspects of the development which should be taken into account. The increase in traffic, the pollution, air pollution, the fact that we need to preserve our open spaces as much as we can. I think those would be reasons that I would not favour the development at all. But I think the infectious diseases aspect cannot be used as justification.
But can South Africa afford to prioritise environmental issues over the critical need for human settlements?
The selection of the site was very poorly done. And the day that something goes wrong, it will be too late. You will kill hundreds of people before you can rectify that. Why don't they take that and go onto other council-owned land between Lombardy and Alexander Township East? It's called River Club. Why don't they go and build there? That'll take 10,000 units.
Bokamoso initially agreed to avail itself for an interview with Special Assignment, but later pulled out. In part 1 last week, we mentioned that the tender to build a mega mixed-use housing development on Rietfontein Farm is worth 80 million rand, according to a document advertising the tender in the Government Gazette in 2011. The Department of Human Settlements and the developer have since told us that the development is now worth 20 billion rand. This issue has also become a political one. Bill Rundle, a DA ward councillor whose ward borders the Rietfontein Farm, has also joined the voices that are against the development. He alleges that the tender was purposefully advertised at a questionable time of year to limit bids.
It surfaced that this tender was issued on the 9th of December in 2011. It was done and dusted in a space of 28 days, which is unheard of in the tender business. What was very peculiar was that tender was issued in an industry that has compulsory closure in the over December period. So there was really nobody operating. However, they deemed it fit.
We consulted Kamogelo Mampane, who is the CEO of the State-Owned Enterprises Procurement Forum, about this issue.
If you look at the public procurement processes, one tick that the government department have to meet is that the tender must be advertised in the Government Gazette. Now, the Government Gazette also realized that there is a closure period, that dead period, between the middle of December and the middle of Jan. So what the Government Gazette does, it closes as well during that time. So the tick which needs to be done, or the investigation rather, that needs to be done is that, was it advertised in a Government Gazette? So if it was, then there is a compliance. So the government department will have complied.
This document confirms that the tender did comply and was advertised in a Government Gazette, despite concerns being raised about its timing. But Rundle alleges that only 2 bids were successfully adjudicated.
It creates a lot of questions, and I guess back to your question to say, was it the right time to publish, hence you receive so few bids. But you have to open up the tender and see if it was unresponsive, because the regulations in terms of triple PFA say that if it was unresponsive, then you have grounds to cancel the tender. But then you have to deal with the bid that you received. Whether it's been competitive enough, that's a question that the organization always have to deal with.
Mark Corbett, the CEO of Century Property Development and Director of Equicent Infrastructure Development, disputes these allegations and insists that the company followed all tender regulations. Last week, we interviewed the Gauteng MEC for Human Settlements, who promised to look into issues surrounding the development raised in Part 1. This week, the MEC met with the developer and invited special assignment to that meeting.
Can you show them where the hospital is?
This development is about a 20 billion estimated worth of an investment. And there's no way that any good or reasonable business person could actually put such a huge investment in an area that is not suitable. However, we will still make sure that we get all the necessary documentation that demonstrate beyond doubt full compliance.
But the community too has been accused of having ulterior motives for their objections to the development. Some say their opposition on health grounds is a disguise to actually prevent lower-income people of colour from moving into the area.
But the biggest issue in this area is the fact that the current residents are scared that inclusionary housing development will decrease their property values. And that's the reality of it. I think this is the new South Africa. Everybody must acknowledge that you need integrated developments. I think this is going to be the first of its kind in South Africa. It's going to be an integrated development where there's inclusionary housing, where people can work, people can live.
It's not about the economic status of those people. It's about the fact that you're going to move 8,000 families, moms, dads, kids, onto land that is potentially dangerous to them and their health.
As government, we will not accept that any part of our province be, classified or categorized as a no-go area for certain people based on their racial profiles. So we will not allow that a housing, human settlement development be blocked because of racial stereotypes. So if there's anything, let it come out. If there's nothing, then we know that we're dealing with prejudice and stereotypes. I've heard some people saying that, they are concerned that there are going to be RDP houses in the area. And I'd like to say to them, the lowest property value that I understand is going to be in that development is around, the lowest is about 350,000.
While allegations of tender issues and non-environmental compliance made against the developers remain to be confirmed, the MEC has given his assurance that the Sizwe Hospital will not be touched at all during the development, but he believes nothing else is standing in the way.
So all those issues are now settled. The issues pertaining to graves, their location, and all those issues, I will get a report of the processes they followed to comply with all matters pertaining to the graves. And I'm pleased that the graves, actually they were explaining to me that the graves falls within another process of treating them as, heritage sites?
Heritage parks.
Yeah, it's heritage parks, which the developer is dealing with through the necessary structures of government.
While the developer and the MEC have given their assurances that they are confident about where the graves are located, with the records missing, there may still be thousands of unlocated graves buried on the land. And with differing opinion on what could be the implications of developing on a place with such a history, it seems the concerned communities may just have to wait and see, and hopefully their fears will not come true.